Thank you, Bonnie. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Well, first of all, I want to express what a pleasure it is to be here and to speak to you because, as Bonnie pointed out, I've been coming to this park for 10 years now. And as you all know, you can't help but fall in love with the place. And it's an incredible honor to work here. And it's an honor to share my work with you today and tell you a little bit about the things we found out over the last 10 years of jay and tree watching, I guess. And before I really jump into the subject matter, I want to point out that the science that you see presented here today isn't just done by a single person or by a single group. It actually takes a whole collaborative, including the land managers, the reserve system, the academic institutions, funding, as well as universities that all work together to enable researchers to come out here to conduct their research for graduate school and beyond that. And so I'm just lucky that I get to spearhead this today, but you actually get to see the efforts of a lot of people represented. What's so neat about the Channel Islands National Park is that it can be used as an example to study global phenomena. And here's what I mean with that. So on the Channel Islands, we can, for example, study the interaction between a jay and a tree. And it can teach us something about something that happens on a regional scale, for example, in California, but also about a phenomenon that happens on a global scale. At the same time, we can take the insights that other people have gained from around the world when managing forests, when watching birds disperse trees and so on, and apply them to the Channel Islands National Park or in other places in California. And this is really the great opportunity that we have here, that we have a national park that is research-oriented, that allows us to find out some important things, especially in the context of the recovery of habitat. When we think about California habitat and diversity in California, there's one person that comes to mind in particular, Joseph Grinnell. Joseph Grinnell is arguably the most influential zoologist in Western North America. He went and did huge transects throughout the Sierras and throughout California. Very early in his career, captured the biodiversity out there. And people still work off of his work. And Grinnell was a very observant gentleman. And when he was out, he was looking for chipmunks, I believe. He had these observations of watching jays. And he was watching these jays in the foothills of the Sierras around Merced, heading up towards Yosemite. And he saw that these jays were constantly transporting acorns all day. And he looked at the acorns and he saw that when they just fell off the tree, they just rolled down the hill. But when the jays took them, they always seemed to be flying in all directions, and importantly, a lot of them uphill. And so he realized that there must be an important interaction happening between these birds and these trees. And here's the quote that he wrote in this paper called Uphill Planters in 1936. He says, "It is not extravagance, but good investments for the oaks to provide subsistence for a continuing population of animal associates." What he's referring to here is that the fact that there's a symbiotic interaction between the birds that receive the food from the trees. The birds, in return, provide a service to the trees, seed dispersal. And that's what the story is about today. And what I'm particularly going to focus on is how this interaction, this mutualism, this interaction between the two organisms can be sort of taken advantage of when you're trying to restore habitat or when you're trying to accelerate passive restoration of habitat, which is important here. And when we take existing ecosystem dynamic and harness it for our purposes, we call that an ecosystem service. So an ecosystem service is something that benefits people that comes from nature. There are all kinds of ecosystem services. There are provisioning ecosystem services, meaning people go out and harvest things out of nature. They sustain us. There are regulating ecosystem services. You have marshes that clean up water. You have clean air that is provided by large forests. You have cultural ecosystem services. As you all know, we get lots and lots of visitors in the national park, and what they derive from it is mental well-being. And it's actually, the more people are allowed to do research into it, the more it shows going outside and going to natural places is good for mental health. And obviously for looking good on the cover of Birding magazine. And finally, there are supporting ecosystem services. Supporting ecosystem services are the types of ecosystem services that keep ecosystems going, the ones that we're interested in going. For example, pollination the elephant in the room, right? Everybody knows about the bee problem. And so humans actually rely on supporting ecosystem services more than they think they do. And the one that we're going to focus on today is seed dispersal. But first, let me talk about a little bit how birds provide ecosystem services. One of the important ecosystem services you see every day on the road as you're trying to drive on the highway and some pesky crow just makes it away from your bumper, they're cleaning up the roads from things that are potential health hazards, right? You don't want to go pick up that carcass. You don't want that carcass to fester there forever. And turns out corvids and birds in general tend to remove that from the ecosystem and thus provide a health ecosystem service. In certain areas, for example, in the vineyards of California, people have now discovered that birds that generally eat insects and not fruit can provide the ecosystem services that reduce the insect load on crops. So by mounting bluebird boxes in your vineyard, for example, you can reduce the crop damage by insects, and the birds are providing that ecosystem service. Finally, pollination. Again, birds are not so often pollinators in North America. You see a lot of hummingbirds pollinating stuff, but in the tropics and so on, they're extremely important pollinators. And finally, seed dispersal. Maybe a little bit hard to see, but this poor bird down here is covered with a bunch of sticky seed. And seed dispersal is an important ecosystem service because it provides that movement from the parent plant. Now, why would it be important for a seed to move away from the parent plant? First of all, imagine you fall right below your parent tree and they shade you out, they steal your water. If there's somebody that's specialized on eating that kind of seed, they're going to be right around that tree where the seeds are. And pathogens too, right? If they're an adult plant, maybe sickly or so on, it will pass on the illness to the young. So as a plant, it's often considered important to move away from your parent plant. And that's seed dispersal. Now, seed dispersal comes in a bunch of different ways. First of all, a plant can just actively throw its seeds. Throw its seeds, right? And you will always see that the shape and the delivery method of the seeds is adapted to that mechanism. So if you wanted to throw something really far, what little balls do we have that we throw or chuck really far? Golf balls, right? So if you look at these little poppy seeds, they're actually very similar to projectiles. They're like golf balls. And the plant responds to the wind and then chucks the seed out. It's a very active way of doing it. If you were somebody that wants to travel with the wind, well, then you'd have a little set of wings so you can travel away, right? Then there's also plants that are adapted to seed dispersal by water. And finally, as all the dog owners or people that like to hike out and about, a lot of seed dispersal by traveling on other guys. That's a lot of fun to clean up, I'm sure. So this kind of seed dispersal in general is called chory. This is called zoochory. And I'm going to show you a few categories of zoochory. First of all, you can go through the intestinal tract. You can be eaten and pooped back out. And that's seed dispersal, assuming the animal doesn't poop right where it ate. Some animals can't take down the whole seed, but they like to eat the fruit. So they'll gobble up the fruit, get the juicy part, and get the rest back out. And if they do that in a different place than where they picked up the fruit, that also serves as seed dispersal. This is called epizoochory, when you're traveling on top of someone. And all of us have experienced it. Plants have an incredible array of adaptations, of mechanisms by which they can hook onto the animal that they travel with, and then at some point get released again. And finally, there's a special category of seed dispersal that's called the zin-zoochory, so together. And what this means is that the animal actively picks up the seed, transports it somewhere else, and puts it back down. And that usually occurs in the context of food hoarding, right? And animals aren't hoarding food or seeds in order to disperse plants. And I would just want to make this very clear today. When we talk about jays dispersing seeds, they are not planting their future habitat with that in mind. It's sort of a co-adaptation. The plants are hijacking the birds, and the birds are hijacking the plants. Everybody's happy. So this food hoarding comes in two big categories. First of all, why do animals hoard food? Anybody? Yes? for the winter, right? So if you have an abundance of food at one time of the year and then no food at the other time, what also happens when you have abundance of food? Think about the candy bowl in front of the classroom in a first grade classroom. What happens when that is there and freely accessible? Right, the kids are just gonna stuff their pockets and take all the candy they can. So by hoarding food, you can remove a resource from competition, right? Because then you know where the food is and it's not freely available for anybody to grab. So food hoarding is both a strategy to overcome future resource dearth, I guess, and to remove something from competition. Speaking of competition of jays, you guys know these guys. The Acorn Woodpecker, aptly named, is a larder hoarder. So acorn woodpeckers tend to put all their food into one place. Think of your kitchen cabinet, right? Your fridge. We have all our food in one place. So zoologically, or in behavioral ecology, will be called a larder hoarder. Now, what's the problem with a larder hoarder, if you have a larder? Excuse me? Fire, right? So there could be some kind of mechanism that takes your larder away. Flood, fire, it could mold. You could have the big bully come over and be like, oh, nice larder, I'll take it. So that comes with a certain set of adaptations. For example, these acorn woodpeckers are year-round territorial and defend these so-called granary structures. You know, they made each one of these holes into the tree. It's a lot of work. And they defend them in a big group. And they're actually kind of the bullies of the oak landscape. We have a few of them on the Channel Islands, but they won't play too big of a role today. The other kind of seed hoarding is called scatter hoarding. So here we have 3 oaks somewhere in Spain, and each one of these lines represents the movement of a seed away from the parent plant. As you can see, it's basically all over the place. And these are jays. These are Eurasian jays moving these seeds, and they scatter their hoard in the landscape. Now what they do is they take the seed, and I'll show you in a little bit, they fly away and put it in the ground. And what's the problem with the seed being in the ground somewhere in the room or somewhere in your territory? Right, it's only worth as much as you remember. So these animals that scatter hoard, often have strong adaptations to spatial memory. They're very good at remembering where they put stuff. They're also good at remembering if somebody was watching you cache. Because, you know, if I know Anthony wants to steal my candy, I'm going to pretend I cache it over here, but I'm actually caching it over here. So they have all these adaptations to both social pressure and to memory. And scatter hoarding for plants is actually a good way of seed dispersal because, as you can see, this involves moving away from the parent plant. This one, not so good for the seeds. This is often in an oak tree. I call it oak purgatory. You get the seed and get stuck right back into mom. It's not very nice. So scatter hoarding is actually a very common behavior, and it consists of three things that happen that are important for the plant at this point. The first thing that happens is, so here we have 3 steps of scatter hoarding illustrated by this beautiful scrub jay. At the first stage, so if you've ever had acorns in your hand, you'll know that some of these acorns sometimes have a little hole in them. And do you know what's in there? Yeah, it could be a wasp or a weevil. So there's some animals that like to predate the acorns before they ever leave the tree. They're still up there. That's called pre-dispersal predation. The problem is, if you have an acorn that's now bad, it's not viable anymore, it won't turn into a baby tree, you would waste your trip on your seed disperser, but the seed dispersers are actually quite selective because they don't want a package full of insect poop. They would like to have a fresh acorn, please. And so they're very selective. When they're at the tree, you can see them sometimes, they pick up an acorn and they rattle it a little bit. And if it doesn't have the full mass, then they're assuming it's been predated and they'll chuck it and get the next one. Now what that means for the plant is that the quality of the crop that leaves the tree is in better shape than the actual crop on the tree, right? So there's a fitness benefit. Only the stuff that's good even leaves the tree. The rest stays on the tree. The second important thing is that habitat fragmentation is real. You know, parking lots are going up and agricultural fields are between stands of trees and so on. And in fragmented habitat, seed dispersers that are not on the wing, such as squirrels and rodents, they don't tend to cross the open areas. That's just not their thing. Whereas if you're on the wing, you can easily fly over that parking lot or fly to the other side. And so in fragmented habitat, dispersal by birds is more important. And they tend to have longer dispersal distances because they have broader spatial ecology. And finally, and this is kind of neat, and this is about the closest it gets to real planting, is that the jays, unlike other hoarders, they tend to put most of their seeds into the ground, about an inch deep, covered with a little fluff. And if you're a gardener, what do you do with your acorn? That's what you do with your acorn. And note how the acorn, with its point and sort of ballistic design, is actually designed to fly with these birds. It doesn't create much drag, right? It's actually a co-adaptation that the acorn shape also allows them to cache it more easily. And the acorn has its embryo right here somewhere in this part, so it can immediately start growing there. So you can see that the co-adaptation between the plants and the animals is quite evident. Animals, of the animals that hoard food, there's one famous family, the family of the Corvidae. The Corvidae are the crows, jays, magpies, and nutcrackers. And I found this beautiful figure here online that has some of the representative, the largest songbird of them all, the common raven. Kind of troublesome animals, but hey. And some crow, magpies. Here's the Eurasian jay, the jackdaw. If you've ever been to Europe, you may have heard of them. Very cute birds. And up here are some Neotropical Jays. The Corvidae have a very broad distribution. I don't know why they didn't make it to southern South America, but they're pretty much everywhere else where it's livable. The cool thing is, at the beginning of my PhD, I was really interested to see, well, how much do we know about the relationship between these birds and the trees that they disperse? And so I went and worked my way through the literature and tried to find every paper that describes in any way the relationship of seed dispersal. How do these birds, how many seeds do they take? Where do they put them? And one of the important things we found that the seed dispersal thing that we see here in North America, you know, with the California scrub jays here on the mainland and with the island scrub jays on the island, is actually a global phenomenon. So here's what we found. It's a little bit of a complicated map, but I'm going to walk you through it. So in the black outline here, you see the distribution of pine species that are animal dispersed. And that means that their seeds have lost their wings. There are about 111 pinus species out there, and about 20 of them have completely lost their wings, which means they rely on animals to disperse them. And if you look at that distribution, it's pretty big up into the boreal zone, and then here a big chunk of Eurasia. Clark's nutcrackers and Eurasian nutcrackers have this orange distribution here, and the Clark's nutcracker is just here on the west coast. But you see that they tend to overlap quite a bit. The same for the oak species. The oaks are these shaded out areas, and you have their main seed disperser in Eurasia, the Eurasian jay, which goes all the way from the UK to Japan with 35 subspecies, likely matched up with different oak ecosystems. And in North America, you see that we have a whole bunch of jays. We have the pinion jay, and we have the Aphelocoma jays, which includes the California scrub jay. Now we have an interior scrub jay called the Woodhouse scrub jay. There's a scrub jay in Florida that also exists on weird little shrub oaks. I just got to visit there. It's crazy. And then, of course, we have our famous blue jays, our loud neighbors that tend to be aggressive. The blue jay and the Steller's jay are sister species, and they're also important seed dispersers no matter where they occur. And so this kind of sums up my first point, that we can learn a lot about the Channel Islands from global processes and vice versa. And I'm going to dive into a little bit of the work that we did on the Channel Islands. So one of the questions we had is, what did the island scrub jay, what was the role of island scrub jays in the recovery of Santa Cruz Island? Because as many of you know, Santa Cruz Island from 1985 to 2005 had an incredible recovery of the vegetation. Some estimates say that almost 50% of woody plant cover increased, or it was almost a 50% increase of woody plant cover over these 20 years, which is an unheard of recovery. And our question was, well, how much did the seed dispersal of oaks by these jays play a role in that? And the main player here is the island scrub jay. The island scrub jay is a lot bigger than the mainland scrub jay. So people here also tend to call them blue jays. Does anybody know, and ornithologists, friends excluded, what the distinguishing feature of an island scrub jay is? Because size doesn't count. Anybody? Brighter blue, okay, but those are all relative, right? But there's one thing that you won't ever see on the mainland scrub jay, and that's blue undertail coverts. is what they're called. So if his little butt feathers are blue, and you see him on the mainland, call us. No, but as you can see, the birds are also a lot larger. They're almost 40% heavier. And so that is actually one of the adaptations that we see very often on islands, is that animals either get bigger or smaller. And the island scrub jay is truly the beast among the scrub jays. This is just neat. And this illustration, by the way, is done by David Sibley, who's the leader in illustrating birds. And I really love it because he captured that bird so well. Now, one of the big questions about the island scrub jay when people first started studying them, or as people were studying them, was, are they actually in trouble? For a while, there was a guy named Charlie Collins from Cal State Long Beach who was out there, and he was estimating population sizes out on the island, and at some point, his estimates were dropping very quickly. And so he approached the Nature Conservancy with this concern that the scrub jay may be declining. And so a whole research program was started to see what the population dynamics are and how many jays there are. And we had sort of estimates that were based on very few sightings. We didn't really know how many there are. So my friend Scott Silla went out there and they surveyed for jays all over Santa Cruz Island. And each one of these yellow points is a helicopter point of which an ornithologist was dropped off and looked for jays. And with that, with covering the whole island, we were for the first time able to come up with a realistic estimate of scrub jay density out here. And this is what it looks like when you put all that in the computer and you model. And here the red areas are where lots of jays are common. And in the green areas, you do see the occasional jay, but not very many. And so this is the distribution of great jay habitat on the island. And our estimate is that there are, 2,500 jays more or less out there. And to ask the question whether they actually affected the habitat recovery that we were talking about, we had to learn about somebody else too, because it takes two, right? As we said earlier, it's the symbiotic interaction between the jays and the oaks that we think fueled the recovery. And the player here is the island scrub oak, Quercus pacifica. It's a little scrub oak that's endemic to the Channel Islands. It exists in large populations on Catalina and Santa Rosa, obviously on Santa Cruz, and then there may be, I keep hearing about potential trees on Anacapa somewhere, mid-Anacapa. In order to find out how the birds and the trees get along and what they're doing, we established 3 study plots on Santa Cruz Island. We had one here at Portezuela, one around the field station, and one in the Coaches area. And in each one of them, we would find birds, we would color band them, and we'd figure out what their territories are, how they're using their habitat, and then watch them do behavior. And in order to figure out how many acorns they have available, which I'll tell you why it's important in a second, we also did lots of oak surveys. And these oak surveys, we have one big survey that we just finished for this year that we do across the whole island. And then in our study plots, we also have higher resolution surveys where we go visit a bunch of trees and try to figure out how many seeds they produce. Because one of the big questions is, how much does the variation in jay abundance, how the number of jays out there vary as a function of their main food, the acorns? And in order to answer that question, we have to quantify, we have to measure how much food there is. And a very simple way to measure how much food there is by doing a timed count on a tree, what we call the acorn count. And so we would go and find, we had these 50 trees, we go to them once a year, and for 15 seconds, 2 guys count as many acorns as they can get, and that's our estimate of the tree's acorn production. And the cool thing about oak populations is that they do a thing called mast seeding. Mast seeding is, I'm sure most of you live somewhere where there are oaks nearby, and some years you have incredible amounts of acorns laying around in the fall, and in other years, nothing, right? And that's a population consequence of their reproductive strategy. These guys, every once in a while, have tons of acorns, and everybody does so. It's called a mast year. And then the subsequent year, it's very likely that they don't have any acorns. And this sort of back and forth of synchronized seed production is called mast seeding. And one of the ideas about this synchronized seed production is that it's actually meant to affect the fate of the seeds. Because who all eats acorns? Squirrels, jays. Let's talk about the mainland: deer, pigs, weevils, bears, right? So there's a lot of animals that eat acorns, but not very many that actually disperse acorns. So in order to just overcome all the eaters and get to the point where you can potentially get dispersed, you have to swamp them out. And it's called predator satiation hypothesis, if you can satiate all your predators. And then on top of predator satiation is where the dispersal hypothesis comes in, that the idea is when there are lots of acorns out there, the jays actually disperse more acorns into the landscape. However, this idea hasn't really been tested with numbers very much, and so that's one of the things we did. And in order to do that, we caught a bunch of jays with our very sophisticated box, stick, and string method. Mostly it's a sprinting technique because you have to be ready to get that jay out of that box very quickly. Then we color band them so we can recognize them in the field, and then we use behavioral observations of their foraging behavior and of their scatter hoarding behavior as they're putting seeds into the ground. And so this is what I did for 3 years in my PhD from 2009 to 2011, and here's some of the results. First of all, we found out that an individual jay caches between 3,500 and 6,500 acorns per year. So if you scale that up to the estimated 2,500 jays we have in the landscape, in a good year, there's 7 million acorns flying around on jay airlines, right? But that's a big number. We also saw that they avoided the acorns with the holds on. That's important. Remember, the quality that leaves the tree is better than the quality on the tree. We also found that it's what's called context dependent on seed production, meaning that in years where lots of acorns are available, they hoard acorns at a much higher rate. They're much more into the acorns than in years where there are no acorns around, few acorns around, then they're not even that interested. We also found that the dispersal distance, they're very interesting results. First of all, the mean dispersal distance is about 40 meters, 45 meters depending on the year. But we've seen flights up to 400 meters and beyond. So this is a big flight over one of those Santa Cruz valleys with an acorn. And what's really cool is that we found this effect of seed crop size. And let me show you what I mean. First of all, here's the distribution. This is a histogram. And what you see here on the bottom are the different dispersal distances. So that means that's how far we saw a jay fly with the acorn. And here on this axis, you see the proportion or the percentage of the flights that we saw. And so you see that a lot of flights were over very short distances here within 100 meters, but then some of them went very far. And somewhere here is about the median distance. And here, over here, we see that same relationship, this median distance here, as a function of the acorn count. So this is how many acorns were available per tree in that study plot. And this is for 3 different years with 3 different plots. So we have 9 points up here. And here's the median distance, so how this curve sort of shifted back and forth. And you see that when we have more acorns in the landscape, the dispersal distance increased by as much as 40%. So we went from 30 meters mean distance in bad years to 50 meters mean distance in good years. And this is really interesting because this means that not only the number of seeds that goes out changes very directly as a function of the seed crop, but also the dispersal distances is affected. And that's important for the plants. Finally, we saw that most of the scatter hoarding that happens in the fall is acorns. You know, there's all kinds of other fruit out there that they like to eat, but they really focus on the acorns. And this really cool thing that's called habitat selectivity. So for some of the birds, we mapped out the territories and we looked at how are the different kinds of habitat represented in the jay territory. So how much open area is there, how much chaparral, the shrubby stuff, how many big trees, and then we looked how do they hoard seeds as a function of that. So here's what that looks like. Here on the bottom we have these different habitat categories. So baccharis, which is the coyote brush, and mule fat, chaparral, coastal sagebrush. This is grassy and open areas, large trees and other stuff. And in the black, you see the mean cover in the jay territory of this habitat. So a big normal jay territory has quite a bit, almost 50% open areas and grassy areas, and about 30% chaparral. And then here in the white bars, you see the proportion of caches that we saw to go to this area. So if the jays would just randomly put the seeds out into the landscape, then we would expect these proportions to match because, you know, they have 15% oak in their territory, so that's 15% of the seeds go there. But what we see is very different. We see that chaparral gets a lot more of the seeds than it's expected by its abundance, and they don't like caching in the grassy open areas. We think that that has to do with the fact they don't like to be watched. Remember, I don't want Anthony to steal my chocolate bar. And they like to cache around plants because it likes to help them remember where they put the seeds. Imagine you put a candy bar out in the middle of the room somewhere, and then you come back 10 days later and you're like, oh, I think it was a meter from there. But if you know you cache it on the side of the little stool, you know exactly where to go. That's what we think is happening. So we do think that the jays are important seed dispersers in the oak ecosystem out here. You know, the dispersal distance, the dispersal rate, everything seems to indicate that this symbiosis is important. But so far, we only looked at the jay dispersal on a relatively small scale in those territories. And the big question is, you know, how does it function island-wide? And second of all, how would it look if you took jays and let them disperse seeds somewhere where they can't disperse seeds right now? And that was Santa Rosa Island. As you all know, part of the Channel Islands National Park, the second largest island off of California, currently does not have island scrub jays and kind of looks like this. It's an island that's in trouble in the sense that the topsoil has been eroded, a lot of the oaks have been removed, and non-native vertebrates had quite a strong impact on the island. And what used to once be rainforest up here, if you've ever been up to the Soledad Oaks, is now more of a moonscape. And the question is, well, you know, how would jays function out there, and were they ever out there? And we do think that they were out there for a couple of reasons. First of all, as you may know, when the water levels were lower, all of the northern Channel Islands were connected to be one island, Santa Rosa Island. And now we get more and more evidence from the fossil record and from owl middens that there were actually jay bones found on San Miguel, on Santa Rosa, and so on, which seems to be indicative of the fact that the jays were there. Also, as a Smithsonian biologist, I like to point out that there was a Smithsonian ornithologist that came out in the late 19th century, visited Santa Rosa Island, and was informed by the ranch hand, John Moore, informed me that there are jays on the island. So there seems to be some evidence that the jays were out there, but at least it allows us to test some ideas about what the impact of the jays would be. Because Santa Rosa could use all the help it can get in terms of oak dispersal. So in order to see what the impact of jays would be on Santa Rosa Island, we constructed a scenario. And the scenario is when you put together everything you know about how an ecosystem functions, and you simulate what would happen if you did some kind of management action, if you did some kind of intervention. In this case, bringing back a seed disperser. And that's called scenario planning. And why would you construct such a simulation model? Well, first of all, it allows you to determine the potential outcomes of management action. So what would happen if I brought jays back? What would happen if, you know, we added more oaks in a certain area and so on? So that allows you to play out experiments without really going out into the wild. And in order to do so, we come up with a mechanistic simulation of the ecosystem processes, everything we know about the two interactions in this case, and spatially explicit, so that means we take the map of the current distribution of a plant or an animal and basically make them move in the realistic distances that they can actually move. And in order to do that, you do what's called an agent-based or individual-based model. So you model what an individual oak or an individual jay would do in this landscape. And in the end, what it does, it's an in silico, so a computer experiment that generates hypotheses and predictions that we can then go out and test in the field. So we can go out and say, well, the simulation says this is where we would expect jay dispersal to matter, so we can go out and pretend to be the jay and put out acorns and see if it would actually happen that way. Or we can test it on Santa Cruz Island. So in order to put this model together, we used all kinds of data. We used acorn production data, we used jay movement data, we used published estimates of rodent impact on seedlings, where the seedlings occur, and what density the trees are out there. And then we built what's called an ensemble model. An ensemble model, and this work was done in collaboration with Christopher Baker at the University of Melbourne. An ensemble model splits the island into 50 by 50 meter squares. And within the squares, we look at what the elevation is of the island. And we simulate these tree populations. We put a virtual oak in there, and we let the oak go through a normal cycle that we've quantified. How many seeds does it produce a year, and how often does it do that? how much does it grow every year, what happens with the jays and so on, and I'll show you what it looks like a little bit. So the oak part of our model basically simulated the life cycle of an oak. What's the probability that an oak produces an acorn, that that acorn is planted and turns into a seedling and a sapling and back to a reproductive adult? You do that with a so-called life table. And then we simulated, once this tree did produce acorns in our model, we simulated the dispersal part. And we had 3 key trajectories. You could either be taken by a jay off of the crown and fly off into the landscape. You could fall down and just roll down the hill. If you were on a steep slope, we had gravity dispersal. You'd keep rolling until it flattens out. And or you can be taken by a little mouse and be carried up to 10, 20 meters. And we had 2 questions that we wanted to ask with this very complicated model. First of all, we wanted to see, are we able to recreate the dynamics of Santa Cruz Island? Because on Santa Cruz Island, as I showed you earlier, the habitat recovery was very quick and very broad. And so we were wondering, well, do we need to, when we plug in the jays, can we recreate that dynamic, and what would it look like without jays? And what we did to train that model is we used the observed distribution of oaks in 1985 on Santa Cruz Island and in 2005. The National Park published 2 great vegetation maps where we had a pretty good idea of where the oaks were. And as you see here, this is this 50% increase. And then we took all these parameters, all these things we had measured about the oaks, and plugged them into the model and saw if we could recreate that dynamic. And we were able to create 92% of the extent at which the island recovered. So basically our model was pretty good at getting the acorns and the oaks to where they really were based on all the things that we have put into the system. And when we left out the jays, we actually saw very little change in the spatial dynamics of the oaks. We saw mostly downhill dispersal, which is what you would expect without your uphill planters, without those jays that take the acorns into the next canyon. And we also were interested in the elevational distribution of these oaks because of the uphill planting story, right? And so if you look at here's our elevation gradient on Santa Cruz Island, almost 800 meters. And here's the number of 50 by 50 meter cells that are covered in oaks. And you see that they increased uniformly across the landscape because Santa Cruz Island already has jays, it already has oaks up high, and so not much change there. Now, what do we think would happen with this model when we take this best model that we have for Santa Cruz that explained quite a bit of what happened and took it to current oak stands on Santa Rosa Island? So if you look at Santa Rosa, it has only 25% oak cover left. And here on the right, we have what would happen after 40 years. You see that there's a little bit of downhill dispersal in the model without jays, but in the model with jays, you immediately see that the pockets start growing up and outward. And this trend continues. Here we're at 80 years, 120 years, 160, and 200 is as far as we went. And if you compare the 2 models, the one without the jays and the one with the jays, you see that this whole pocket down here would not develop without the jays right now. And the idea here is that, it takes a jay to pop out of the canyon and fly over into the next canyon in order to start a new population in an area where they currently can't go when just rolling downhill. And this difference here is a 500% difference in terms of oak cover. So at least in our in silico experiment, I highlighted this area because it's kind of neat, we think that the jays could help a lot. And how would it affect the distribution of the oaks in height? So Santa Rosa Island isn't quite as tall as Santa Cruz. Here in gray, you see the current distribution on Santa Rosa Island. So these are, again, the number of cells filled with oaks. And then here in dark gray, you see the distribution that we would expect in 200 years. Now, why is it so important that these oaks get pushed uphill? What happens on these uphill slopes? As you know, fog happens. So the number 1 water input in the Channel Islands National Park is fog. And when you have topsoil eroded away, the fog just flows by out into the Pacific. However, if you have a population of trees out there that are putting out their leaves and catching, precipitating all that water out, then it goes into the ground, it goes into the streams, and so on. And that's why we think that an upward shift of oaks would have a really big impact on the whole ecosystem. And as you know, or as you may have heard, there's a cloud forest restoration project happening on Santa Rosa Island right now, where Catherine McEachern is trying to basically do some ecological triage to get any kind of soil and any kind of water to stick around. And this kind of leads me right into where we want to take this work from the next few years. Here we go. So one of the things that I didn't talk about today is the jays and the pines, both for the bishop pine, the pine that's common on Santa Rosa Island, as well as for the Tory pine. The jay could be an important seed disperser and could thus affect the spatial dynamics. That's something we're trying to work on. We do experiments where we cache acorns as if we were jays and look at how well they germinate in different areas. You know, they always say when you're an animal behaviorist, you slowly turn into your study animal. It's true. I hoard acorns. I put them in the ground. I love oaks. Just I make it across the channel and the jays don't somehow. We're trying to test some of these hypotheses about what would happen on Rosa in terms of seed dispersal and what isn't happening right now in the context of the broader restoration efforts. And one thing that's really important is we're bringing out lots of young students and volunteers and people that are interested to these islands, and A, involve them in work so that they're contributing to the improvement of the island, but B, provide them with an exposure to this incredible resource, which is our national park. These kids come out there and they learn about the ecosystem dynamics, they learn a little bit about how science and technology really works, and what kind of career paths you can pursue, that you don't have to be a guy in a white coat with a monocle, you know, sort of staring down, that we're a very diverse, very active group of people that are scientists, and we're trying to inspire these future stewards of our land to also catch the bug of the island, right? And that's a big thing we're doing. We do a lot of our field work with young students that come out of community colleges from Southern California that are then mentored by people that are already in UC and so on. So we have a whole horde of students that are coming out with us every fall and help us with research. And it's for me, the most rewarding part of our work. And the newest thing on our future work docket is this 258-acre fire that happened in the Central Valley of Santa Cruz Island. You wouldn't be able to tell from this photograph that it's a fire because fennel is incredible. So this photo was taken in May, a month and a half after the fire. And you can barely see that anything happened. I guess the coolest thing about this photo is the absence of the giant eucalyptus stands in the middle. But we're taking advantage of this fire scar to learn a little bit about how the jays could help restore fire scars. Because in Southern California and in California in general, you know, a lot of habitat is currently being consumed by fire, and this system here on the Channel Islands allows us to learn about the role of jays in the fire recovery, because here we can go and count the seedlings that are out right now. We can go and see how many acorns are the jays dispersing into the fire scar right now. And one thing we're trying out that we learned from, incidentally, from German foresters who in the 19th and 18th century would try to restore their oak habitat by putting out little feeders with acorns. We're trying to see if we can pull the jays into the areas that burnt and see if they can kickstart the restoration of the oak habitat by, remember, when there are lots of acorns available, they hoard a lot more acorns than they need. And so we're putting acorns out there, we're pulling them down from the canyons and pulling them into the areas that have burned to see if we can kickstart this restoration of the island by the jays. And it's involving student volunteers, which is great. That means the students are learning science, we're getting data, and everybody wins. And this is a great example of how what we learn on the Channel Islands can affect management and our knowledge about, you know, Mediterranean ecosystems in general and across California. I happen to study a lot of these ecosystems in the NRS sites. That's why I have the NRS sites up here. They're an incredible resource, but also globally, because our understanding of seed dispersal and our study of seed dispersal out here has gained attention around the globe, and people are realizing that we have a great simplified study system in which we can learn more about this interaction between these amazing birds and amazing trees. Well, and with that note, I want to thank you for your attention. I have one little thing before the questions come. Here's a little
Boom time
BBC
comes in
footage.
autumn, when the oak trees drop their acorns. This is when the jays get busy.
They pick up the acorns and they fly with them somewhere. I just wanted to show you that real quick. We made it onto BBC with our island scrub jays, and they have amazing footage of these jays caching. Unfortunately, I'm not good enough of a video editor to make nice videos. With that, thank you so much.
During our training in the Naturalist Corps, they told us that there are two types of scrub jays on the island. One eats acorns, and the other one has a longer, thinner beak and eats flowers and berries. Is that your experience there?
So, yes, there are, I would say, two extremes of the phenotypes. We have jays that live in pine habitat that have longer, thinner bills, and that seems to be an adaptation of foraging out of the pine cones of the serotinous pines, the bishop pine, whereas the jays that mainly feed on acorns have a hooked, sturdy bill in order to pry open the acorns. And feeding trials on the mainland where that variation also exists, where there are jays that live mainly in pines and jays that live mainly in oaks, have shown that they're more efficient at their respective strategy. So that seems to be a foraging adaptation. Yes?
Yeah, I was wondering what additional studies have to be done before you might actually relocate the jay to Santa Rosa, reintroduce.
That's a very good question. I think that we have to have a good understanding of what their role in the food chain is, what impact they have on other animals, how easy it is to transport jays from one area to another and let them establish there. We're also currently doing seed production surveys on Santa Rosa Island to see if there's even enough food for jays out there and a habitat. And then there's a sequence of steps that has to be taken from the management side. We provide the numbers, but we don't make any decisions from the management side in order for such a step to be taken. And we can, if there are other questions that come up, we try to answer them with numbers, but it's not our decision. Yes. Oh. Get there eventually.
I like the idea of repopulating naturally with the jays, the acorns. But in practice, if you have a bunch of acorns, like from a surplus year, would you get more trees by scattering them either with the students or in a helicopter or airplane? Or are the jays really more efficient or something?
That's a good question. So there's a couple layers to it. I think the first layer is if you just throw out acorns, they're going to die. Acorns are what's called recalcitrant. They don't do well in the seed bank. They dry out very quickly. They only do well if they're in a shady, dark spot immediately. So you can't just throw them out. In fact, the mortality decreases by 50% if you just stick them in the ground. The second thing is that, yes, if you're thinking about restoring on a small scale, it would make more sense to go out and plant individual acorns. But I showed you earlier the rainforest, the cloud forest restoration on Santa Rosa Island. And it took, I don't know how many hundreds of volunteer hours, including getting people out, fed, housed, and so on, so on, so on, to get 3,000 acorns into the ground. I think it was 600 volunteer hours. That's a single jay. And the jay is gonna give back his acorns, some of them, and eat them, but there's still a bigger chance of them being out there. So when you want to scale this up, and when we're thinking about the mainland, that may have a bigger impact. And I agree, to put out the platform, that involves work. But there's a cool study actually from a forest in Sweden where they compared the methodology of humans planting oak seedlings that are going to make it, and they looked at the density of naturally regenerated oak seedlings that were planted by the Eurasian jay and calculated how much value a jay pair would make up per year, and it's $30,000 to $45,000 per year per jay pair. So when you scale it up, it really changes the dynamics.
being an insular species, they're threatened by disease. Is there discussion ongoing of vaccination for the birds? I know it's easier said than done, especially with boosters, but is there talk about vaccinating the population of the birds?
There used to be talk about vaccinating the birds, so the jays there's a core population of jays that was vaccinated for a certain time, especially until we had solid estimates of their abundance. It wasn't clear. We stopped vaccinating. Now we have very intensive monitoring so that we would detect very quickly if there was a decline in birds, which would then allow us to respond to it. One of the things that hindered us from vaccinating more jays is that they discontinued the product. And that means, that would have to be a new development of West Nile virus resistance. So it's quite costly.
Yeah, this is going back to the maybe impacts on Santa Rosa Island if you were to bring jays back. So are there other birds that might be, partially at least filling roles that scrub jays might play, so that the scrub jays might,
Impact them
in some way?
Well, that's one thing we're working on. I think you're hinting at the shrike question. The shrike is obviously a very important bird on the Channel Islands and has received a lot of attention from conservationists. And the question is, would jays negatively impact shrike populations? We're currently trying to get a shrike study off the ground on Santa Rosa Island on Santa Cruz Island to get very clear idea of what that is. In terms of the strongest effect, it would probably be the reduction of grasslands out there and the increase of oak woodlands. But I just got off of Santa Rosa Island, and it is full of shrikes. I mean, I don't think that the expansion of the oaks back into the areas, on Santa Rosa where they would reduce the grasslands up on the plateaus and the areas that the shrikes really like. So. But it's a question that would of course have to be addressed, and before we can address that, we have to understand what the interactions are on Santa Cruz Island, and we're working on that right now. A couple questions in the back.
Is it too far for the jays to fly over to Rosa, or is it that they don't need to?
How do I say this? They don't go, because if you're a jay and you have a grassland, so you look on the west end of Santa Cruz, and the last big jay territories are sort of where the Christie Canyon still has big trees, and maybe even over into the Southwest Canyon. But in order to even get to the beach, to make the decision to fly over water, you have to fly over hundreds of meters of grassland. And it's not the area where jays go. So a jay never even finds himself in the decision of like, whoa, should I fly out onto the water? The other question is, are they not motivated to go? That's a really good question. We think that up to 50% of the adult jays that are on the island are not breeding. That means they're competing really hard for breeding opportunities, and they would love to go somewhere where they can breed freely. So one of the ideas why the jays may have gotten so much bigger is that they compete really hard for breeding territories. And so I think the birds would be very motivated to go. And finally, despite their amazing aerial abilities, they're true scrub jays. The biggest flight you'll see of a jay is when he's popping up from somewhere high and flying somewhere low. And then he's going to land on a tree and do the next flight and do the next flight. And so they're not very good long-distance flyers. They're mostly gliders, right? When you see a jay, they're like gliding down. And compare that to the similar-sized acorn woodpecker, who is a great disperser. Acorn woodpeckers disperse up to 10 miles away from their natal territory just on the mainland. And so they've actually recolonized Santa Rosa Island recently. And so we're actually trying to learn a little bit about the acorn woodpeckers as well. But from a jay perspective, I don't think they'll ever do it on their own.
I was wondering what the percentage recovery was of those acorns.
Ooh, yes.
Estimate?
Me too. There are some estimates. The one study that worked with Florida scrub jays, mind you, a very different system, found that they recovered only 30% of the acorns in a good year. It's really hard to estimate. You watch a jay cache an acorn somewhere, and you go over there and you try to find that acorn. You either find 5 other acorns, or you can't find the freaking acorn you were looking for. So it's really hard to do, just technically. But a way that we can get at that is by looking at, well, what's the energetic value that jay is stashing away every year, right? And we know from several corvids that they hide multiple times their annual requirement in kilojoule or whatever energetic unit you want to use in the fall. And because these seeds don't remain in the seed bank and the jays won't get them back, that means that there's a good amount of seeds, at least in the years where they hoarded a lot of acorns or pine seeds, that stays in the ground. Got one more question now, a couple more.
Do the ravens on the island eat the acorns?
Well, eating, absolutely. Caching, sometimes. I know people have seen them cache acorns occasionally. Most of the time I've seen ravens handle acorns is when they really want to make the acorn woodpeckers mad and they start pulling them out of the granary.
Sounds like a raven.
Yeah, exactly. They're kind of cheeky. They don't need to do that, but they enjoy doing it. But it's a serious question. We know that that the ravens tend to hoard other kinds of food normally. When there's a whale or something that gets washed ashore, they hoard chunks of meat. They're more of a competitive hoarder where they're trying to remove the stuff rather than store it all winter. But yes, I do think that the occasional acorn gets cached by a raven on Santa Rosa Island. We also know McEachern has documented uphill movement of pines and so on. So they're not the only players, but they definitely don't hide multiple thousands of acorns a year.
You mentioned the grove of eucalyptus trees that they took out on the conservancy side. Were the jays using the eucalyptus trees as habitat?
Yes and no. Breeding jays barely use the eucalyptus trees. We have the non-breeding jays that hang out in these no-gooder groups called floater groups. They're causing trouble. And the floater jays like the tall vegetation to hide into. It's a good place to hide from raptors, and it's a good place to hide from territorial jays because they can't defend a whole eucalyptus tree. However, the acorn woodpeckers are also in the eucalyptus tree, so there's a little bit of fighting there. I do think that they've shifted the dynamics a lot out there. You stand in front of one of those eucalyptus trees by the field station, and there are hummingbirds and warblers, and there's a lot of animals in there that wouldn't be doing what they're doing if those trees weren't there.
Mario, a couple of questions. One, you were talking about flying over water, and if they could disperse to Santa Rosa, and explain the grassland scenario. So with that in mind, we sort of learned with the fox population that it's likely that they were probably brought out to the outer islands by the Chumash, and it's possibly even Santa Rosa, the San Miguel, Santa Rosa, and Santa Cruz. Is that possible, you think, of the scrub jays as well, especially considering the interaction between Chumash and acorn usage and scrub jays and acorns, and has that been looked into? Because it's highly unlikely that if they're not flying to Santa Rosa, they wouldn't have flown to Santa Rosa when they were all combined back a long time ago. So I'm wondering, one, what are the indications that people may have brought the jays out there to begin with?
I think that the evidence is pretty strongly against it for two reasons. First of all, the oldest remnants of Native American populations are 15,000 years, and our genetic estimates tell us that the jays have been out there for much longer, probably 500,000 years, definitely past longer than the last glacial maxima and so on. So
even at that distance, I think it was 7 miles or 5 miles, so they're still flying over pretty large sections of open water.
And
so that brings in the natural dispersal of jays themselves, right?
Well, and you think about the Montecito slide or something. If there's a large chunk of population that gets washed into the channel and so on, it's hard to know why, for example, we don't have the California towhee on the islands and we have the spotted towhee on the islands. So I think that's digging back into the biogeographical history to a point where it becomes hard to say what really happened.
Yeah. I only bring this up because I'm leading to the second question, which is they're obviously ecosystem engineers. So if you're talking about moving them from one island to the other, Okay, there's other plants and other organisms that jays positively and negatively impact. So you really need to be really careful if we're going to be moving animals around. It's like moving wolves or other populations to other areas, or ferrets to the Hawaiian Islands to control things. So there's a little bit of it, I look at, there's a little bit of uncertainty. I mean, there's a little bit of documentation, the one blurb from the Smithsonian, a little bit of fossil record, but it seems to me in the evidence that's been presented that there's a bit of uncertainty if they were really truly out there, and looking at the consequences they might have. Do you think that the risks are worth taking, considering?
Well, I think to me personally, from that perspective, the Santa Rosa Island thing really convinced me, because there must have been an oak belt that went from Anacapa to San Miguel. The second thing is there's barely any jay bones found on Santa Cruz Island itself. So, there's not that much archaeological evidence of jays. And you mentioned the Native Americans earlier. I was having a conversation with Lynn Gamble, the anthropology professor from UCSB, about why the jays aren't in the Chumash lore, either as the enemy that steals your acorns, or as this demigod that, just like you, is totally obsessed with acorns. And so it's a relevant question, right? However, there we're talking about an oral history that may have been interrupted at some point. But as far as the ecosystem impact and the impact on the other organisms, if we know that the Miguel find is probably 1,000 years old. So that means they were here they were on Miguel since the last glacial maxima. If the sighting by the Smithsonian biologist really holds true, then they were there as recently as 150 years ago. So one of the things we're thinking of doing next is modeling how much wood left Santa Rosa Island, how much oak woodland came down off of that island, how much was it suppressed by the sheep presence and by the processing of the sheep. How many burned, how many BTUs, basically how much fire was used on that island, and how much forest habitat that would have cost. And then probably a combination with high raven abundance, which is a strong nest predator. That's what could have led to the extinction of the jays on Santa Rosa. So that's one of the avenues that we're pursuing now, is to see what are the possible scenarios for the current absence of the jay. Got one more question.
When you mentioned the ravens in the nest and the predation on the jays, I'd heard with researchers out there that the ravens got the key in the location of the jay nests by watching the researchers, and then go after those areas to predate on either the eggs or the chicks afterwards. You talk to that at all?
Well, it's hard to really measure. The ravens are obviously these incredible smart animals that also learned how to open the tubes for the seabirds, that when they put the artificial nests out for the seabirds, there were tubes that had a screw top, and they learned from watching the guy checking the nests that you can unscrew them. So they're very smart. As soon as we even had the inkling of an idea that we may be increasing predation rates, we changed our methodology. We're not going into the nests anymore. We were first worried that we may be leading a scent trail for the foxes, because if you've ever seen the fox will walk up to you and hit your boot with its nose because it's so busy smelling. And so, the second we thought we have an impact on the predation of these birds, we changed our methods. And the other thing is, we're coming to realize now, we have 10 years of reproduction data on these jays, that there are just years where all their nests get knocked out. They barely have any young. And so it seems that they have a very slow lifestyle. These jays get up to, I would say, 20 years old. The oldest one we had is 16 or 18 years old. So the slow lifestyle also means that they can afford to sit out a couple breeding seasons and then reproduce in a good year. So there seems to be a combination of that, right? That predation rates are high with these specialized predators, and reproductive rates are generally low. And but yes, we thought we had a signal, and as soon as we had that, we changed our methods.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Pesendorfer, for your dedication to the Channel Islands and to the island scrub jay.